So another cash rate hold from the RBA this month, which may come as sweet relief to mortgage holders around the country. But is it only temporary relief? Could we see Governor Lowe deliver another rate hike in his final month as governor? Well, let's see what Judo Bank's Chief Economic Advisor, Warren Hogan, thinks. Warren, thanks for joining us on the Savings Tip Jar.
Thanks for having us on the show.
Thanks for being a repeat guest and a friend of the Savings Tip Jar podcast, Warren. So just straight up, what did you make of the RBA decision just then?
It looks like the new government's finally having some influence on the RBA with the new board members coming from the union movement. We've now seen them explicitly push out the return to inflation by 6 months to the end of 2025. If we had known this, of course, last week, we wouldn't have forecast a cash rate increase, because basically what they're saying is we're not raising rates, we're going to live with inflation for longer. That has a range of implications, not least that it's going to bring the misery to the broader community for longer. People on fixed incomes who are suffering from the cost of living pressures will experience that for longer. It's also a transfer of wealth from the broader community to the government through higher taxation and bracket creep. But putting aside all those sorts of things, the bottom line is they leave us open to them getting it wrong on the economy. Now, most central banks at this stage of the game, as we saw last week with the Fed and the ECB, some pretty serious players in our world, take out insurance. They want to make sure they get rid of this inflation. The RBA is not doing that. And of course, if the economy proves resilient, and I think a rising housing market's a pretty good sign of that, then they're going to be in a situation where inflation could get away from them next year, and they'll have no choice but to jack up rates so hard they'll put the economy into a deep, bad recession, which we didn't have to have. So it's a big, momentous day, actually. It's only been half an hour, but the more I think about it, the more we've just seen a massive strategic policy change in this country.
So, Warren, as I touched on in the intro there, we've still got one more month left of Phil Lowe. Do you think perhaps that'll be the time for him to deliver another rate hike before new Governor Michelle comes in?
Yeah, look, I think he's going to be forced to, because the last week's CPI was pretty good, but it's an absolute illusion. It was a one-off soft quarter. We're going to get the monthly indicator from the ABS for July, and we know on the 1 July, that's the important time for price increases in this economy, because it's the start of the new financial year in Australia. And we know that not only do all the administered prices that are indexed go up, and they're going to be indexed big time on the back of some high inflation in the last year, but we know of heaps of announcements that came through from the private sector, insurance companies and transport logistics, and they're just the ones that they talked about it. Most people don't tell people when they put their price up. I think we've seen the Melbourne Institute indicator yesterday was up 0.8 in the month. Our Judo Bank PMIs for July picked up price increases across the whole services and manufacturing sector. They're going to see that, and they're going to realise that, they're just too skinny at 4.1. But it doesn't change what's happened today. Today, they've changed the whole game on monetary policy, in my view, on the back of what was very dovish monetary policy anyway. I mean, the Governor Lowe has just done as little as he possibly has to. He's well below what rates are in other countries overseas. So I think that you might get one more, but they're not prepared to go hard on this. They're not prepared to they're not determined to get inflation down, basically. They're lying to us.
So you mentioned that Dr. Lowe's a little bit dovish. That's probably putting it politely. Does the new incoming governor change anything, given she's also had 40 years at the central bank, and especially around the RBA review? There's going to be more scrutiny, a bit more transparency, arguably, into the RBA from 2024. So does that change anything?
Yeah, it does. It does. We're going to see the new Monetary Policy Board have non-RBA people outstrip RBA people. These appointments will come directly out of Treasury, and therefore the government. One of the first things I was ever told as an economist by my father, who was a professor before I even thought about doing economics, was all the Treasury cares about is revenue. And that's why they like inflation. They at least like it at the start until it wrecks the economy and they get no revenue. But right now, the Treasury is loving all this revenue they're getting from this inflation. And they're going to appoint these people on this sort of whole new care economy sort of mantra from Albo. And I think they're going to stuff it up personally. But yeah, she won't have control of monetary policy. And despite any of her instincts are to take some risk, sort of, some insurance out, you might say, I don't think they'll let her. So things have changed a lot. And, unfortunately, people like me, it's the worst fears are playing out.
Some pretty strong views there, Warren. let's talk about the so-called fixed rate mortgage cliff that a lot of people were talking about quite a few months ago, and the talk seems to have died off quite a bit. But I think we're kind of in the middle of that. The sort of peak in the wave of fixed rate mortgages expiring. Do you think to some extent that is doing some of the RBA's heavy lifting, with some of those rates going from 2 to reverting to over 6%, and perhaps that's driving a sharp cutback in spending?
Yeah, look, it is, and we've already seen a lot of it. As you said, we're about halfway through, and I think we'll start to see spending slow a lot more in the back half of the year. But the question is whether that's enough. But there is no doubt that we're going to have quite what you call a nominal shock. That is, interest rates have moved up so much that people's funding costs have shifted, and then they're going to have to really rethink what they're doing. And some people, I think, are having to sell their property. I mean, I think the reason listings are so high through the winter is that people are opportunistically and very smartly taking advantage of this buoyant market to reduce the risk in their own lives. We're not going to see, though, a subprime type forced selling wave or anything like that emerge on the back of this, is my strong feeling. And the simple reason is people have jobs. I think the most important piece of data in the last month was the employment numbers, which are just unbelievably strong. We've been bringing in all these people in this sort of catch-up phase of the post-pandemic immigration plans, which is great, but it's all happening in the space of 12 months. But then they're coming in and they're getting jobs. So I don't think we're going to see a lot of distress enter the housing market. I think we're seeing a very orderly adjustment, and that's good. But is it going to, sitting behind all this is the highest inflation in 2 generations, the tightest labour market in 50 years. It just seems to me like the balance of risks is sort of skewed at the moment, but that's not the way the Reserve Bank's reading it. So the economy will slow for sure, but I don't think it's going to fall over.
For sure, Warren. We'll just ask you one more thing. You mentioned immigration coming in, from now and into 2024. To what extent could that be kind of masking the numbers, making them look better than they are? So with regards to unemployment, you said that was still incredibly strong and aided by a strong uptick in employed in jobs and so on, and also GDP figures as well. What do you make of that? And are they kind of making the government look better than what they're actually achieving?
Yeah, well, I mean, they certainly give us a greater chance of avoiding a technical recession, which we know is the worst fear of the Treasurer and probably the Prime Minister. But, it does complicate the efforts to slow demand in the economy, because in the end, the problem is this economy is out of equilibrium. It's out of whack. Our demand is running above its supply. That's what's creating inflation domestically. And of course, until you get that demand and supply back into some sort of balance, you're not going to get rid of the inflation. And you run the risk, of course, that the inflation deteriorates if there's some other shock down the track. So, the way I describe it is it's increased labour supply, which should, all else being equal, reduce wage risks. Wages really racing away because you're bringing more people in. But it's no silver bullet to the problems we face. It's going to add to demand in the economy. The one thing that the RBA is probably relying on, in fact, the forecasts on Friday, which are updated, should show this, is we can get that unemployment rate up to about 4.5 without a lot of job losses, because we've just got so many people coming into the economy. But at the moment, they're coming in and they're getting jobs, which of course means they're going to be spending. So I think the real risk is that the economy just doesn't slow enough because of this. It seems to be, something the Reserve Bank isn't concerned about.
Warren Hogan, thank you so much for your time on what's a very busy day for economists such as yourself. Really appreciate your insights, and cheers again for joining us on the Savings Tip Jar.
Fantastic. Anytime, guys. Have a great one.
Thanks, Warren. Yeah, you too.
So yes, that was Judo Bank's Chief Economic Advisor, Warren Hogan, there with some strong criticisms of the RBA's decision to hold rates steady this month. But now let's hear from our next expert guest, Peter Tulip, who's the Chief Economist for the Centre for Independent Studies. Peter, welcome to the Savings Tip Jar.
G'day, Dominic. G'day, Harrison.
G'day, Peter. Thanks for appearing on what's quite a momentous day, I would argue. So just first cab off the rank, super simple yet super broad. What did you make of the RBA's decision just then?
So it wasn't very surprising. There hasn't been a lot of news over the last month or two. inflation came in a little bit weaker, a little bit lower, but employment was a little bit stronger. That seems to have essentially cancelled out, and so the RBA didn't. I'd be really astonished if anyone was very surprised by this decision. And you see that in the accompanying statement where there were no substantive changes to the wording on anything, and it doesn't look as though their forecasts have been significantly revised in one direction or the other. So overall, it's a bit of a non-event.
Now, Peter, we know that you used to work at the RBA yourself, and I also note that you had previously actually called for the RBA to carry out back-to-back 50 basis point rises. Has that view of yours changed? Do you still think they need to go as high as 4.85, or do you think we're probably near the top now?
No, I think while I think it wasn't a surprising decision, I also think it was a disappointing decision. I think we need higher interest rates. And the reason for that is I think the labour and housing markets are seriously overheated. Previously, when we've had an unemployment rate of 3.5%, like in 2008 or the 1970s, that's been accompanied by rapidly accelerating prices and wages. And essentially, it's got out of control. And were that to happen again, the RBA would need to jam on the brakes and put us into a serious recession. So I think what I'm calling for now would be a slight increase in the unemployment rate relative to what the RBA is projecting. But that's to prevent a much larger increase in unemployment down the track. I think we need to aim at stabilising the unemployment rate, and it looks like a sustainable rate, maybe about 4.5%. I mean, who knows? But that's what past experience would suggest. And the quicker we get to there, I think the more stable unemployment and inflation will be, and the closer they'll be to the targets that the Reserve Bank should set for them.
For sure. Now, we'll cast our eyes to September, Peter. That'll be Dr. Phil Lowe's last monetary policy decision for as he's in the chair as governor. So do you think this changes things around September's monetary policy decision with the new incoming governor? Will it be much the same to avoid, maybe a slight optics or PR disaster? Do you reckon he'll go one more to avoid the heat coming down on Michelle?
It would be surprising were they to not move in the last two meetings, but then do something in September. I'm trying to think of what big data would come out between now and then. It's
wages
possible.
Growth, I think, is the next sort of big-ish one.
Yeah. So, but the relationship between wages and inflation is a pretty rubbery one. So it would take a very surprising increase in wages, I think, for them to substantially change their inflation forecast. The exchange rate, house prices, lots of things could move. There's no real reason at the moment for thinking that they'll do something dramatic that would cause for a change. My guess is that they'll stay here until the next quarterly CPI comes out. My guess is that that's going to be a disappointing one. I mean, I just think the RBA's forecasts are a bit optimistic, and sometime soon high inflation numbers will surprise them. And when that happens, they'll raise rates, is my guess as to how the next few months play out. But that's pretty much assuming no surprises. And of course, that never happens. Really, what I'm saying is that positive surprises on the inflation outlook are slightly more likely than negative surprises. And by a positive surprise, I mean that inflation is more likely to be a bit higher than the RBA is expecting than to be lower.
And Peter, what about the housing market? What will this latest decision from the RBA to hold rates mean for the house price movements we're seeing in the country? I mean, we saw the CoreLogic data come out today that showed house price growth has slowed from 1.1% to 0.7%. Do you think this decision to hold will further stimulate maybe some more growth in the housing market?
Well, so that's 0.7 in a month, isn't it? So that's still going up faster than almost anything else in the economy. And that has surprised quite a few of us, including me. I had thought with these big increases in mortgage rates that would really take a lot of the heat out of the housing market, but it appears to have been more than offset by these high immigration numbers we're getting and by people, the desire for more floor space that's as a result of working from home. So there's a lot of strength in the housing market, both in prices and in rents. And I guess when I say strength, it's always an ambiguous word, isn't it? I'm saying that both prices and rents are going up very quickly, and the pause, if anything, will throw a bit more fuel on the fire. That some people, I suspect, were holding off, worried that mortgage rates are going up. This gives them a bit more confidence to bid aggressively at the next auction.
We'll move a bit more to the RBA itself now. So, it's not just a kind of faceless central bank. There's people, there's employees, and you are a former employee of the central bank. So I note in your parting letter to colleagues released under Freedom of Information, you criticised some of the workings of the RBA. You criticised the lack of transparency within the central bank, and there's a bit of a difference between monetary policy setting and then what research and what economists, the sort of rank and file members are thinking and feeling. So I guess the review into the RBA that Jim Chalmers announced earlier this year, or as he became treasurer, is meant to address some of these transparency issues. Do you think what's been announced so far does much to address that, or do you think there's way more to go?
Oh, I think the recommendations of the review panel were very good and will go a very long way to addressing the problems that I mentioned and that the review panel also found. A lot of it will depend on the enthusiasm of the RBA leadership to put them into effect. That there are some things that the government can do, and from what Jim Chalmers has said and Angus Taylor, the Shadow Treasurer, has agreed to, there appears to be substantial agreement in Canberra behind. I mean, they can do some things like change the legislation, put experts in charge of the Monetary Policy Board and so on. But some of the biggest challenges relate to changing the culture of the RBA, that it needs to be less hierarchical, more open to questions, have more deliberation, more engagement. The staff need to be invited to challenge views of the leadership. These are all things that are very difficult to enforce from outside. So Jim Chalmers has appointed Michelle Bullock, expecting her to implement some of these changes, and we have to keep our fingers crossed that she delivers on that.
Now, Peter, when it comes to getting inflation back down, there's two ways you can do it. Obviously, there's monetary policy, and then there's also fiscal policy. It does seem like the government has really been relying on the RBA to do a lot of the heavy lifting, which I'd say with the fastest rate rises in recent history suggests that is the case. But do you think that there is much more that the government could be doing, and if so, what should they do?
My view, and this is something that macroeconomists disagree on, my personal view is that you're better off setting one instrument to one target. It's what's called the Tinbergen rule. Because if you have lots of different people all responsible for the one objective, if you've got lots of people responsible, then you've got no one responsible. And the end result is buck passing. And people will say, oh, look, we've done our bit. We've tightened policy by X percentage points or Y billion dollars or whatever. Now it's up to the other guy to do their bit. And past experience in Australia and other countries is that not enough gets done and it moves too slowly. The other problem is that fiscal policy is just a bad instrument for fine-tuning of the macroeconomy, that we're about to see tax cuts come into place that were legislated, 4 or 5 years ago? Mm-hmm. I mean, the lags in fiscal policy are just terrible. And since they were legislated, we've thought, oh, they're much too much, they're much too weak. The economy has moved up and down with cycles. Granted, it was a pandemic and unrepresentative, but the economy adjusts far more quickly than fiscal policy can. So my personal view is that fiscal policy needs to be set with long-term objectives in mind, such as debt stabilisation, microeconomic management, income distribution, and so on. That's plenty for Canberra to worry about. We don't want to give them another thing to worry about, which is macroeconomic stabilisation, which in any case they're not very good at. It's Canberra's job is to set the objectives of the central bank, and then it becomes a technical question as to how to achieve those objectives.
I guess my next question is, with that in mind, Peter, has the RBA become a little bit populist? Have they relied or been a bit more too keenly aware of what the sentiment is felt by consumers? Because there's all this media now, including us, and they were beaten in the media for supposedly saying no more rate rises till 2024, which wasn't really a promise at all. And I challenge anyone to kind of name the previous RBA governors. So what's your take on this, and has this kind of influenced policy decisions?
I think the biggest problem that the review points to is the unrepresentative nature of the RBA board, that it's a majority of them are just business leaders, and they move in a narrow world and are very exposed to the views of people in that world. And there's been a concern that broader views of society haven't been given as much weight. It's funny, though, the remedy that the panel suggests will sound to some people as though it's going to make that even worse, because they want a lot of monetary policy experts to make monetary policy decisions, who will, in a sense, live in an even more unrepresentative, secluded world of their own. And that's true. But the hope is that we'll have decisions based more on research and data, the sort of stuff that academics live in, rather than the anecdotes and stories that business leaders tend to be fond of. And there's a concern that without those business leaders making decisions, there'll be less exposure to the real world. The problem was that, those leaders were just incredibly unrepresentative. And so you'd get the worldview of one particular business leader from one particular company. I don't want to mention names because they all did it, would shed, their experience of their particular company. And that would just be massively overweighted relative to the bank's liaison program, which in a representative, comprehensive way tries to take account of what hundreds of businesses and other people in various aspects of the economy and of society are telling the bank. And so the hope is that it will lead to much more more representative decisions.
Peter Tulip, I'm afraid we're out of time. Really appreciate your insights, and thanks so much for joining us here on the Savings Tip Jar.
Thanks, Dominic. Thanks, Harrison.
Thanks, Peter.